Seahawks fans, wherever you may be, welcome back for another edition of the Seahawks Playbook Podcast. Join your host, Bill Alvstad, and co-host, sports writer and football analyst Keith Myers, as we talk Seahawks football. Seahawks fans, welcome into the Seahawks Playbook Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Alvstad, here with Keith Myers, and we're talking Seahawks football. And welcome into the show, man. Good to see you. Good to have you on again for like the 228th consecutive week.
Yeah, 228 consecutive weeks. That's a lot of weeks. It really is.
Yeah, we're almost related at this point.
We got a fun show this week. This one's going to be a blast.
Yeah.
So
yeah, we just kind of created this just to kind of get through the doldrums of summer, which we're now beginning to get into, and it's our Seahawks top 5 lists, and we've created a couple of different categories and a team list that we will go through at the end, where Keith put together his players, I put together mine. We're coming together on the show, comparing notes, maybe have a few debates, and mostly just a lot of fun, just kind of going back to memory lane. This would be a good show for some of our listeners and other fans that were just born in the last 20, 25 years. Some of these guys that we're going to be talking about go all the way back. And so it'd be good to kind of refresh some folks' memory on some players from the distant past that really had a nice effect on the franchise overall. So I think we're going to start with our personal favorite Seahawk players of all time, top 5. You go first, Keith. Are you going to try to do reverse order? Or do you have
let's do reverse order, and let's go back and forth. So I'll do my 5, and then you do your 5, and then we'll do that. Sure. And then if there's any overlap, we can talk about it that way. So
and we also have a few just missed that we might want to talk about.
Yeah, too. There's some obvious ones there. So when doing favorites, like this wasn't meant to be the best, right? This was those guys that we just have like really fond memories of, that for some reason they were just guys we rooted for, even if they weren't the best player. And so, yeah, I'll get you started. Mine is a fullback at number 5, John L. Williams. This guy, it was by today's standards, we were talking before the show, and you're like, oh, he was more of in today's standards, just a big running back. He ran the ball, he caught the ball out of the backfield. In fact, he was great. Led the team in receptions a couple times as a fullback. But he did block, he did lead block, he did blitz pickup, he did those kind of things, but he was a really good receiver, just a completely versatile guy, and oddly a first-round draft pick as a fullback, which I'm always amazed that ever happened.
Yeah. No, he was, when he was playing, he played from like 86 to 94 or something like that, like 8 years, I think, in Seattle, a couple years with another ball club. But when he was in Seattle, it was kind of a shock because he was the fullback, right? And when he started running the ball a lot, and then he started catching the ball a lot, you were like, what's up with this? Because this is kind of unusual to have a fullback kind of take a prominent role in your offense. And it really, like you said, he really kind of wasn't a fullback. He was more of a large running back who could block in key situations, but he was really, I think he was like 5'11", 235 or something like that. So not huge for a fullback. And he could really move, really get out in space and juke some guys. You mentioned the reception part. He was like, he averaged like 50 to 70 receptions every year.
Yeah.
Which was just crazy. So he had like 4,600 yards over his career, and averaged 8.5 yards, had 19 touchdowns. You mentioned the running. He was also, really decent at running the ball. He averaged probably 600-700 yards a season. on 125, rushing attempts, which is a great average for that guy. Yeah, totally. He's one of my favorite guys. He wasn't on my list, but he's in that conversation, absolutely, for sure. Because at the time that he was playing, definitely one of the favorite Seahawks that was on offense at the time.
Cool. Who's your number 5?
All right, and we'll do the not just miss after that.
Yep.
My number 5 guy, and it's so hard. There's just so many, but my number 5 guy, believe it or not, might be closer to your top, is Cortez Kennedy, defensive tackle. Entire 11 season career with the Seahawks, Pro Football Hall of Fame, almost 700 tackles, 58 sacks, even had 3 interceptions, just a beast in the middle for that team during some really bad years. And so one thing that you could always look forward to when he played was him. And everything else you just kind of forget about, because during the 90s when he was on the team, the team just was not very good and didn't get to the playoffs. He may have gone to the playoffs once, maybe, and then to the Pro Bowl a few times. And that was the highlight of about 10 years for the Seahawks football.
He is 4th on the team's career sack list. So only 3 players have more sacks, and this is a guy that played defensive tackle. So not a defensive end, but he was a guy that could get after the quarterback up the middle so quick, so fast, and he's not like the undersized guy that gets that stuff. He was huge, and still a guy that could get upfield and destroy quarterbacks. And he was really kind of the first interior guy to be known as a pass rusher that had to be feared and had to be accounted for and double teamed on every play.
Yeah. That's always fun too, when you're a just beginning franchise and you get players that come along that are just special, that obviously are the best that ever came along in your franchise history, even though it's a short history at that point. Is exciting for a fan, especially, like I said, when you go through those years where there's just not a lot to cheer for, and you get a single, then you start cheering for single players and single game performances and young guys, and it's just part of the way the franchise kind of grows up, and he was definitely a part of that.
Okay, my number 4 is another Hall of Famer. I know, but Steve Largent. And I'm not sure how anyone who's been a fan as long as you have or I have, it doesn't at least consider him. I mean, he was one of the best to ever play the game, had all sorts of records that Jerry Rice beat.
Yeah. Well, the key thing about Steve was when he broke those records, he was the guy. Yeah. He was the record holder, and so he had all
those records. And then, Jerry Rice came along, and a lot of those kind of records are falling just simply because there's a lot more passing yards out there. There's a lot more receiving yards to be had.
A couple extra games.
He would join the team when the team formed, 1976, played to 1989. But here was the thing that when I was, researching this, so he has the most receiving yards in franchise history.
Still to this day.
Oh, not only that, he's almost twice as much as number 2. His 13,089 receiving yards. Number 2 is 7,620.
And is that Darryl Jackson?
No. Darryl Jackson's 4th.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
But I don't want to talk about 2 and 3 because that's another conversation.
Yeah.
Other players that deserve to be talked about.
Well, I had Steve as number 3 on my list. He was the first Seahawk that I probably fell in love with, right, as a kid. I started going to games when I was 11 years old, and he was the guy that I was looking forward to going and seeing. Now, him and Jim Zorn were just quite a combo, back in that day, both young and took chances and made crazy plays. And Steve was a wizard, just bottom line, he was amazing. at getting open, turning guys around, creating mismatches just by the discipline that he had in his route running and by his imagination, where he could catch guys at the exact moment they became out of sync or out of step or put one foot planted into the ground. He would take that opportunity to completely change direction. And it was not unusual to see Steve with 10 or 15 yards of separation on a defensive back in single coverage. That was became the norm. And talk about sticky hands. This guy could catch anything. And he did it without gloves. It was all his hands. And he was just a crazy, unique player, you know, and he led the league in receiving yards
fast.
a couple of years. He wasn't fast. He ran like a 4 or 5.
Yep. He wasn't overly fast. He wasn't overly tall. He wasn't overly physical.
Except for the hit on Harden.
Yeah, well, there's that. But then,
if anybody has a chance, go out and look at the Mike Harden video with Steve Largent. That's just an amazing series of events in a season. You know, when Mike Harden hit him, kind of blindsided Steve in a game in Denver, and the ball popped out. Steve Largent actually lost 2 teeth in that situation, but he stayed on the ground for a little while. And then he came off the field and he got back in the game. But like 9 weeks later, Denver was visiting the Seahawks, and Steve made sure that he took an opportunity to have a clean hit on Mike Harden after he intercepted the ball and jarred that ball loose in a fumble on an extremely physical hit and got his payback. And I totally respect that.
Yeah, but I was saying, so not overly tall, fast, physical, but was so good that he was described as trying to cover him as like trying to cover air.
Yeah,
it can't be done.
Oh, his nickname was Yoda.
So yeah,
true story.
Okay, so that was
number 4.
Your number 4.
Yeah, my number 4 is Marshawn Lynch.
Nice.
Running back Marshawn Lynch. You know, it wasn't about the yards with Marshawn. It wasn't about his stats. He's got great stats. They look great on paper, 10,000 plus yards, a bunch of receptions, but it's not what made him remarkable. What made Marshawn Lynch remarkable was the way that he ran the ball. Anytime that you saw Marshawn Lynch run the ball, you didn't have to see the name on the back of the jersey to know who it was. He had this big, huge, wide gait, almost bull-legged, with this base that was unrivaled in any other running back, and balance and power. And he put it all together with an attitude. And he was just, he was amazing. You know, he was amazing. That I think puts him at the very pinnacle of all the running backs that have ever played for Seattle. Just sets him apart as a player and a guy that you really enjoyed watching play the game, you know, and he, just the like Beastquake and Beastquake 2 are 2 prime examples of a longer run that exemplified how he ran the ball every time he touched the ball. So every time he touched the ball, he wasn't going to get those breakout runs all the time, but he would run the same way no matter what. And so that was amazing to me. And like the Beastquake, you know, that singular run was probably the best run I've ever seen from any running back in the history of watching football. Just the breaking of 10 tackles, the point in which the game, when he did it in the playoffs, and when the game was kind of on the line, we had a small lead, but we needed a sustained drive to kind of put the New Orleans team away. And he came up with this run, and the stiff arm, like 3/4 of the way down the field, was the single greatest stiff arm I've ever seen in my life, where he just literally ejected a football player and threw him to the side, like 10 yards away, like boom. And, you know, Mike Mayock was like, "Get off me." I was like, that's the greatest comment that you could say about a running back. It's like, "Get off me." And the dive into the end zone and the celebration and the win that got, you know, Seattle, you know, a step further into being Seattle. Like after that, Marshawn Lynch was the physical identity of that team, not only on offense but on defense too, where that he was the guy. So that's number 4 for me, but he could have been higher.
Yeah.
And Steve Largent was number 3 for me.
Yep. And Cortez Kennedy was number 3 for me. So we've actually done both of our top 3. So we'll just skip ahead to number 2. My number 2, the enforcer, Kenny Easley.
Wow.
Strong safety. You want to talk about a guy that just killed people for a living. I mean, we all know like all the Cam Chancellor hits because they're more recent, where he would destroy people who came over the middle. Ken Easley did that, almost 20 years before. Now in the Hall of Fame, got a, kind of a late entry into it. But man, guys were afraid of him. And he played in an era where it didn't matter. It wasn't a penalty if you launched into someone and tried to decapitate him. And so he goes, okay. And he decapitated a few people.
Well, he was big for his era.
He was
like 6'3", 205 pounds. He just looked like a linebacker at the time. Everyone was a little smaller than they are today. So a guy like that really stood out. And the fact that he just plays so physical and had such athleticism, and they didn't do all the measurables that they do now. We just have no idea what he would have done in those agility drills or, vertical leap and all that kind of stuff. Back then, he just played football. And if you look good on tape, you look good. And that was the deal. And, his career was just short, at what, 7 years, 8 years, something like that. And it's, he played in such a physical way and had killer ball instincts, kind of a ball hawk mentality and a decapitator. He would decapitate an offense just to intimidate you, to make sure that you didn't go over the middle for the rest of the game. That kind of a player. He didn't do it in a dirty hit way. He did it in a legal hit, physical way to send a message that this was going to be a tough game for you.
Yeah. 3-time All-Pro in 83, 84, and 85. Had 10 interceptions in 84, which I think is just crazy for a strong safety.
Yeah, that year overall for the Seahawks, interception-wise,
was insane.
Yes.
Why anyone, threw in
look at him and Dave Brown and Harris and a couple other guys that had their hand in that that was one of the most remarkable years for interceptions. I think they even had like 5 interceptions with 3 of them returned for touchdowns against Kansas City that year. So,
yeah. And his career was short. It was, 7 years. And then the team traded him, but he never ended up with the other team because in the physical, that was part of it. They figured out that, all of the anti-inflammatories the team had been given him to eat like candy, had destroyed like his kidney. And, it was a big rift between him and the team for a long time. And it's been recently, they've kind of come back together and he's been celebrated more and they've kind of made amends, but because the team did not do right by him. But when he was here, man, what a fantastic player. What a fun player to watch. I mean, all the things that like I said, all the things we liked about Cam Chancellor, right? Easley was the same guy in an era where you were allowed to hit people more. Yeah. So he did.
Yeah. Well, and he bred kind of a player like Ronnie Lott, for example. Ronnie Lott came right after him and played for San Francisco and was kind of the same sort of player and had arguably more media coverage and so forth because of the Super Bowls that he was able to go into and so forth. But Kenny Easley was a better player than Ronnie Lott. Ronnie Lott had more media coverage. He had more, they started keeping stats on tackles and all that stuff after Kenny Easley stopped playing. And so, yeah.
So
I love that favorite player pick.
And Ronnie Lott's actually one of the big reasons why Easley got put in the Hall of Fame, because he started campaigning for Kenny Easley and was like, no, this guy was better than me. Go watch him. Go watch some tape of him playing. He belongs here. And basically kind of put it on the voters that they'd missed on Kenny Easley, and got him, into the Hall of Fame. And hats off to Ronnie Lott for that, because that's awesome.
So my number 2 overall is offensive tackle Walter Jones.
Ooh, good one.
He played his entire career with the Seattle Seahawks, 7-time All-Pro, All-Decade team, 180 games, started all 180. They had over 5,500 pass attempts while he was left tackle, and he gave up 23 sacks.
And 8 of them were in his final year. He was only
penalized 9 times for holding. And he's a Pro Football Hall of Fame first
ballot
eligibility inductee. And when you watched Walter Jones play, you watched the left tackle play. Like, how many times do you catch yourself during? Now, don't answer this, Keith. This is for our audience. How many times do you catch yourself watching a left tackle play, downs against a team? If there was a matchup that where another team had a great defensive end, you could watch Walter Jones for the entire game, because it was just a master level performance of a guy dictating terms to a premier guy on the other side of the ball. And
it didn't matter who it was.
Yeah,
it didn't matter who it
really
was.
Did not. He was locked down.
And the greats, the Hall of Famers that they played against Seattle, and he shut him down. I believe the greatest left tackle to ever play the game. And I know that I'm biased because being from Seattle, and there are others that legitimately have a claim to that, but just Jones was so good. He was just, we were so spoiled in Seattle with Walter Jones that after his knee kind of forced him into retirement, we didn't know what good was. Because
and we're still trying to find it. I mean, hats off to Dwayne Brown, but he's not Walter Jones.
But you're right, he's not Walter Jones. And even Russell Okung was pretty damn good, and continues to be. But nobody cared. We're like, whatever, because compared to Jones, he was so much better than them. But these are guys that made Pro Bowls, right?
Oh, and I guarantee too, on those 23 sacks that he gave up, like half of those were probably because the left guard had made a mistake or had allowed his player, too much penetration. Jones was trying to slide over a little bit and help or something like that, right? Because this guy was just all focused all the time. Like, he just was not going to allow anybody else to beat him. And he had unconventional ways of training. Like, he would pull his Escalade in the off season with a rope, or push it if he could find somebody that would sit in the and steer. He's just one of those guys where it's just kind of crazy. So that was my number 2. Keith, who's your number 1 favorite Seahawk player of all time?
And this one will probably get some comments from the YouTube commenters, because I know I'm not particularly popular with them. Richard Sherman.
Awesome. Yeah, I can see that.
Which is, you talked about, I am the offensive line guy. I'm the offensive guy or line guy, and I don't have an offensive lineman on here. But Richard Sherman was must see TV. He was loud. He was brash. He was constantly trash talking. He was in everyone's face, but he also backed that up with all pro level play. And he pissed off so many receivers because the best of the league would line up against him and lose. And he was so fun to watch.
Yeah.
He is the football equivalent of Gary Payton in basketball, just
That's funny.
constantly talking and constantly dominating. And I loved every second of it. I was sad to see him go. I get it from a football standpoint and a financial standpoint. I hope that he, gets healthy and gets to continue to play somewhere. But when he was in Seattle, there wasn't anyone that was more fun.
That is so true.
So he is my favorite. So who's your number one favorite?
Well, he was definitely on my mom's list. Like if my mom made a list, Richard Sherman would be on that list because she just loved him.
Yep.
And I did too. I mean, what's not to like? If he's on your team, you're going to love Richard Sherman. If he's not on your team,
you're going to hate him.
Pisses you off. It's just the way it is. I mean, think about how vilified he was with the 49ers before he went to the 49ers. After, they love him. They get him, It's just like Pete Carroll. People didn't get Pete Carroll. When he landed in Seattle, even the Seattle people were like, I don't know about Pete Carroll. He was from the enemy, USC. And he comes in and he proves himself and he does the Pete Carroll thing and everyone loves him. All right. So my number one overall all time for me is quarterback Russell Wilson. And
I was actually expecting that from you.
I don't think it's premature to put him on. Well, this is my personal favorite, so it doesn't really matter. But I don't think it's premature to have him as being on the top of this list already. I think he's earned it. I think that he's an amazing player to watch. I think he changes the game by himself. And it's more of it's a factor of everything that he does and represents from the stats for him really only tell half the story about Russell Wilson. Overcoming the odds with his height and being drafted in the third round and having Seattle already paid a quarterback in Flynn in the offseason to come and compete with that. He wins that competition. The win versus Chicago that year, the 3 straight massive wins on the down the stretch in December with statistically I think we won like 55-0 against one team and on and on and on. And then the almost comeback in Atlanta that year after we went to Washington and beat RG3.
Yep. And then they actually did come back, took the lead, and then the defense gave up.
Correct. Okay.
In the 36 seconds.
Clarification. Yes.
So you're saying you made the qualifier that it's not premature and all of that. So Pro Football Reference, right, which is the fantastic site out there if you want stats or you want to compare things and whatnot, has a thing they call approximate value, which basically just it takes stats and different things and Pro Bowls and All Pros and kind of compresses them into a single number. And they've tried to normalize it across positions. And so it's just, their approximate value. Russell Wilson is the number 1 player in Seahawks history with an approximate value of 148. Steve Largent's number 2 at 140.
Wow.
So
nice.
You want him to, you don't need to justify him being like,
no,
you need to qualify it.
Right. No.
The most impactful player in the history of a franchise that has multiple guys in the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
Hopefully, fingers crossed that the contract crap works out and he's here for a long time. But, second year or first year rookie of the year, offensive rookie of the year, second year Super Bowl champion, went to back-to-back Super Bowls, and just the wizardry in which he plays and the clutch performances and the preciseness of his game, like when he throws the ball, like the moon shot, or the spin or the double spin pirouette play against Arizona, where he's falling backwards, throws the ball up to Baldwin. You think it's kind of just a throw up, kind of a desperation thing, but he's really trying to make that throw at that precise spot for Baldwin to catch it, and then the back of the moon, the moon shot to lock it, which just dropped into a window about 6 inches wide, literally, and then the toe drag, in the back of the end zone to lock it. I think are just exemplify kind of the nature in which he can get it done and how clutch he is. So
Or the him throwing the game winner in overtime in the NFC Championship game against Green Bay to Jermaine Kearse into the guy was straight up covered. There was no separation. The defensive back was in his hip pocket. And so Wilson had
already thrown like 4 interceptions in the first half in that game. And to be able to have
three of them bounced off Jermaine Kearse's
right.
hands.
Talk about like no memory on the quarterback, right? And a redemption situation for Jermaine Kearse. Like that was
absolutely
made for TV moment in Seahawks history.
It was crazy. And just that pass, basically we said, we call them dimes because, you're trying to hit a target the smalls as a dime. There was no target. He had to drop that in exactly perfectly. If it was another inch longer, it doesn't get caught. If it's inch shorter, it gets broken up. Like there is no margin for error on that throw, and it was perfect.
So I have a short list of 3 just missed my list players. I'll just rattle them off really quick. Defensive back, Eugene Robinson.
Yep.
Who's also on another list I have. And then Bobby Wagner and Joe Nash.
Those are good. Those are good names.
Yeah, those are good names, and they belong on a list. Like if I didn't have those guys on a list, it would be a shame because each one of those guys was amazing. Eugene Robinson. Here's a guy that most Seahawk fans born in the last 30 years haven't even heard of. Like, there's just not a lot of mention about Eugene Robinson and so forth in the history of the Seahawks. So
he was the running mate of Kenny Easley.
Yeah,
he was the other
John
safety.
Harris too. John Harris was a free safety when Kenny Easley was back there too for the last part of Kenny Easley's career. But he was as an undrafted free agent. Keith spent his first 11 season with the Seahawks, and he ended his Seahawks as the second all-time leading tackler and second in interceptions. And overall, he had 57 interceptions and 22 fumble recoveries and a couple touchdowns. And it's pretty remarkable. It's a remarkable career. He ended up going on and having a couple Super Bowl appearances, one of which is infamous for a character situation with him and a lack of performance because he didn't have any sleep the night before. So he probably doesn't want us to talk about that. But regardless, football wise, he's one of my favorite guys to watch. And of course, Bobby Wagner will ultimately probably end up being on the main list and deserves to be there, quite frankly. He's one of those players. And then Joe Nash, he's on another list, so I'll talk about him in a little bit. But he was one of those guys that spent his entire career with Seattle. And it was a long
15-year career.
15 years and 218 career games, and damn near started and played in every single one of them.
And played nose tackle. This is a guy that
nose tackle.
He
had 47 and a half sacks as just an undersized guy that's undrafted.
Yeah.
That's what makes him a favorite. He went up and beyond his position when he came onto the team, proved himself and endeared himself and earned it, every bit of it.
Yep. So my just missed, you're talking about Bobby Wagner. I'm like, how is he not on here? I feel bad actually because I missed that one.
Yeah.
But Shawn Alexander, very
he's on my unappreciated.
Yep. Very underappreciated. He was so fun to watch. I know at the end he got a little, he run out of bounds instead of touching someone. And there was a little bit of that, but there was also the year when he had 29 touchdowns and
made the MVP.
Yeah. Was the MVP. And there was some greatness in there.
There was. Yeah.
Yep.
He just wouldn't have been a Pete Carroll running back.
Oh, definitely not.
But he was a Mike Holmgren running back, and that's all that mattered.
So Marshawn Lynch, who didn't make my list, but he was hard to keep off that list because
it's when you're talking about 5 all time in a franchise, it's tough.
Especially, and so it's there, and Doug Baldwin is my third.
Doug Baldwin, yeah.
And I mean, I'm sorry, he was an undrafted. I know, again, it's recency bias. People are gonna be like, oh, it's just because he's more recent. The stuff he did at the line of scrimmage to get separation, especially against the press. I don't know if I've seen anyone better at generating separation at the line of scrimmage than Doug Baldwin. It was wizardry. It was just insanity of the stuff that he was able to do the moment the ball was snapped. Wasn't the fastest guy, bigger guy, whatever, but he had tons of acrobatic, crazy, just insane catches that you're like, how did that happen? And you pair that with his ability to beat the press better than anyone I've ever seen. Yeah. And it was
that's why I'm looking forward to taking a look at DS Scridge, because his hand fighting and technique off the line of scrimmage is unreal. You're going to really enjoy that. All right. So the next list we did was favorite non-Seahawk NFL players of all time. And I have to tell you, this was one of my favorite lists that I put together because it gave me an opportunity to refresh my memory on just how great some of these NFL players have been over the course of history, and my evolution of as a fan, not only a Seahawk fan, but just a fan of football, and watching some of these guys over time. And one player in particular I didn't have a chance to watch that I wanted to definitely mention because later on he became my favorite.
Cool.
I'm going to go backwards, like we did before.
Okay, you start this time.
All right. And I have a good just missed list too. I really do. In fact, the guy that I just mentioned was on my just missed list. Number 5, Walter Payton. One of the greatest running backs I've ever seen. They called him Sweetness for a reason because of his speed, balance, and power. And he was way more physical than he's been given credit for. Everyone thinks that Walter Payton is a guy that's so good and so smooth that he's a guy that wants to step out of bounds, a la Shawn Alexander. No. This guy was a guy that sought out contact, and when he got it, he punished you. And he was great speed guy, and there was no stepping out of bounds with this guy. He did not avoid contact. He's a prolific rusher. I think when he retired, he ended up holding all of the major career rushing leading stats, as well as carries, yards from scrimmage, all-purpose yards, all that kind of stuff. Had a ton of receptions, most receptions by a non-receiver in NFL history, 8 career touchdown passes as well. Just throwing the ball out of the backfield. And he was in the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 93, and unfortunately no longer with us. And he has the namesake of the Walter Payton Man of the Year, which was awarded to Russell Wilson this last year.
Yeah, no.
And go watch some highlights.
Widely considered the greatest of all time. When people say that, nobody debates it. There are other people that want to stake claim to that, but no one ever argues against Walter Payton. It's pro someone else, right? You can't argue against Walter Payton. There's nothing that he did that wasn't great, period. So I'm with you on that. So non-Seahawk, my number 5, Sterling Sharp.
Wow.
Wide receiver.
I've met Sterling Sharp before.
Really?
Yeah, I did. I actually met him in Honolulu, Hawaii.
His brother almost made this list too. But Sterling Sharp, so this is a guy kind of like Easley, had a short career, 7 years, but was a 3-time All-Pro in that.
And his brother was Shannon Sharp, and he was a tight end for Denver.
A couple of different teams, but yeah. And Shannon Sharp was also fantastic, but just look at the reception totals, and in 92, he had 108 receptions. Nobody had 100 receptions back then. In 93, he had 100. He broke his own record with 112. Like, this is when,
And this isn't a big receiver or anything like that. He's a 6-foot guy.
Yeah, he was uncoverable. And just, just a fantastic player. And then, of course, gets hurt and his career ends. Poof, 94, his final year.
Yeah, he played every game, in that career, even though it was short. He played, he started every game and played in every game that he ever was in. So
yeah, he never missed a game. 18 touchdowns his final season. And, only 94 receptions, but that's of course when he got hurt and that, ended his career. But man, he was fun to watch because he was like, it was like watching, it was like watching Steve Largent, but later. So you're in a more pass friendly league, and guy was just at times just uncoverable. Yeah.
So this player is, it could have been my number one. Like, he's remarkable, and that's linebacker Lawrence Taylor. He's literally the beast mode of
a defensive player.
Defense. He would be like, if he was playing today, he would be Pete Carroll's perfect strong side linebacker, Leo. If people kind of imagine that sort of a player, only he was on steroids. Like, this guy was seriously legit the best player at that position to ever play the game. He's the exact prototype that Pete Carroll wants to have on his team and searches for to be able to take that position.
Given the era that he played, he probably was on steroids, since that was, that was
probably. The other thing that freaked me out when I was doing this research was, Keith, LT turned 62 years old this year.
Oh, God.
I know. God. Okay, so you talk about let's talk about Jadeveon Clowney taking over the that one game against the 49ers in 2019. That was Lawrence Taylor every game. Just to kind of put it in perspective, like, everyone still talks about that Clowney game like it was something special. No, that was pretty well typical for what Lawrence Taylor brought to a game on a daily basis. And there are great players who play well, and then there are the greatest players to ever play the game that just take over. And that was Lawrence Taylor, 6'3", 245, the most physical linebacker or edge rusher guy that I've ever seen play. Just the killer speed and explosiveness of and killer instincts of Jamal Adams, only 245 pounds and nearly 6'4". But he played with the same sort of speed and explosiveness and instincts that Jamal does when he rushes the passer and so forth. It just, to see that in a very large human being is just on another level. So,
okay, my number 4, I didn't even realize this when I was making the list, is another Packer, which is weird because I'm not a huge fan of the Packers, just in general. But he didn't just play for the Packers. Reggie White, defensive end. Absolutely.
He's my number 2.
Oh, good to know. Absolutely dominant player, rushed the passer as good as anyone in the history of the NFL, but also was an elite run defender, team leader, just everything about him was he's just a fantastic player. He
wasn't even drafted into the NFL.
He
was drafted into the AFL,
the
or
AFL.
Whatever they call the Memphis Showboats. He played there for 2 years, and then they had a supplemental draft in '84 that he came in.
Yeah,
and played for the Philadelphia Eagles, I believe, to start, and then he had his claim to fame with Green Bay. So,
yeah, just great. Yeah. Great player.
13-time Pro Bowler and 13-time All-Pro, Reggie White.
13-time All-Pro.
Yeah, and he's got 198 career sacks. 198. That's only behind Bruce Smith's 200. 200. That's just incredible to me. That's crazy. Bruce
Smith is also on my list.
Wow. Yeah, I don't blame you. I mean, that's a fun player to watch. All right. Number 3 on my list is just out of nowhere for most people, but there's a few folks that will absolutely get this. Quarterback Fran Tarkenton. Now remember, this is
He's Russell Wilson before Russell Wilson.
Exactly. This is an NFL list. That's an NFL list of my favorite players. So not all-time greats or whatever, but he is in that conversation as being an all-time great. And at the time of his retirement, he had owned every major quarterback record of the modern era. 18 seasons. He had, 47,000 yards, 342 touchdowns. Those were both records at the time. They seem, marginal right now, but they're still kind of top 10-ish. And eighth in regular season wins all time to this day. But what it was with Fran Tarkenton for me was that I'm left-handed, and Fran Tarkenton was left-handed. And when I was growing up, before the Seahawks, my dad's favorite team was the Minnesota Vikings. And so we would watch Fran Tarkenton play, and I would go out in the backyard with all my buddies, and we would play football, and I would be the quarterback, and I would scramble around, and I would fling the ball all over the place, just like Fran Tarkenton. So he was my first kind of, my guy that I emulated my game after and wanted to be Fran Tarkenton. So that was that.
Yeah, his scrambling and improvisation and just his ability to just piss off pass rushers because they couldn't tackle him. He was Russell Wilson before Russell Wilson.
Yeah. And we're talking, late 60s to about 78 or so when he retired.
So what a fun player. So my number 3, we already mentioned him. Bruce Smith, another defensive end, played for Buffalo. Wow. I mean, 200 career sacks, most in NFL history. Was fantastic speed rusher, bull rusher. He could move inside. He could really rush from anywhere. But was, kind of known as more as a speed rusher on the outside because he was really good at it. And then, hurt a knee and came back and was, playing. And they're like, well, he, at first he wasn't 100% when he came back and started playing. And they were like, he doesn't have the speed or the flexibility. He's going to be any good. And instead he just went right through people and showed everyone that his bull rush was just as good as his speed rush. And everyone's like, oh, well, there's that.
He had really 13 years of double-digit sacks.
Yeah.
And during those double digits, they were often closer to 15 instead of, 10.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was crazy the way that he could get to the quarterback.
Yeah, he was the defensive linchpin of that defense that went to 3 straight Super Bowls. They lost all 3 of them, but they went to 3 straight Super Bowls.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah, he was a monster. He was a guy that you couldn't block. And you tried, because every defensive game plan or offensive game plan was to neutralize Bruce Smith, and they couldn't do it.
And no one ever did it.
So are we at number 1?
No, that was my number 3.
Oh, well, you had my number 2 at Reggie White.
Okay. So can I do my number 2?
Yeah. Yep.
Barry Sanders.
Yep. He's my number 1.
Yeah. Go ahead and talk about Barry Sanders then.
Oh, dude. Barry Sanders. He's like the Juke Master 5000 model, right?
Mm-hmm.
He just was one of those guys that was so entertaining to watch. So, it wasn't about, when you watched a Detroit Lions game, it wasn't about the yards. It wasn't about, he's going to take over a game or whatever. It was seriously to watch Barry Sanders entertain you. The stop, start, stop, spin, wiggle, one step, full acceleration was just like unreal. Like, there is nobody that has that stop, jump, cut, full acceleration thing that Barry Sanders had, where guys would just look foolish trying to tackle Barry Sanders. He just was on a completely different level in that way, and to this day. And every highlight film on every carry, even the ones he lost yards on, Keith, was entertaining.
Yeah, and that's
so
a part.
that's the part where he's one of my non-favorites. Is not about. I mean, he's clearly on that greatest player of all time list, but it was just the sheer entertainment value.
Yeah, he was so fun, just so
and he
fun.
retired at age 30.
Yeah, he played for the Lions.
Yeah.
Right? He carried a bad Lions team to the playoffs over and over again. They didn't have a quarterback. They didn't really have a defense. All they had was hand the ball off to Barry and hope. And he
too, right?
and he carried them to the playoffs. And at one point he was just like, I'm not playing for you anymore.
Well, and his last 5 years, he had 1,883 yards, 1,500 yards, 1,553, 2,053. In his last season, he rushed for 1,493 yards.
Yeah.
And career-wise, he averaged 5.0 per carry. That's currently the all-time great per carry average, and had over 3,000 yards receiving too. So he did it all.
Yeah. All right. So, and then my number one, Larry Fitzgerald.
I knew it.
You didn't. I didn't know. He's
on my just missed list.
Larry Fitzgerald, the Arizona Cardinal, great, probably the best player to play in the state of Arizona for that team.
16 years or 17.
And just fantastic player, perfect professional.
Iron Man.
Yeah, absolutely.
Doesn't miss games.
And uncoverable at times. Went many seasons where he was arguably the best player or the best receiver in the NFL, and just played on some really, really terrible teams, but never complained about it. Never had a problem. Everyone was always like, "Oh, he's coming up on free agency. He's going to leave there because they're terrible. He's going to go to a chance to where can win." And he's like, "No, he's too embedded in the community. And he cares too much about the people of the town and city that that he and his organization supports." And he was like, "I'm not going to go play somewhere else because I don't want to be in another town." It's not that he didn't want to play for another team because Arizona was bad most of the time, but he didn't want to be in another town. He didn't want to be away from Phoenix. He didn't want to be away from the people there. And he was just so humble and so awesome. And I had a chance to talk with him at the Richard Sherman softball game. And, because he came up and played. And so I had a chance to talk with him after the game down on the field, and just the nicest guy. Like there was 100 people that wanted to talk to him, and I, from this little tiny site, and he's like, no, he's going to give me the time, the equal time as anyone else. And I appreciated that as the writer, but also just like, he was just such a cool, just amazing guy. So yeah, my favorite player. That's not my favorite non-Seahawk player. There you go.
Yeah. Well, and we've talked about him, at some point, if he could dress up for the Seahawks, that would be awesome. And I know how much you like him. So he was my number one guy on my just missed list. And my second guy on my just missed list probably needed to be up higher. I've been reflecting on this a little bit, was running back Jim Brown. And it's way before, not way before my time, but it's before my time. It's probably before almost every listener that we have, but I would recommend highly to go out and just look at some highlights of Jim Brown. He was a big guy, 6'2", 235 pounds. So he was bigger than John L. Williams, right? He's bigger than any running back Seattle's ever had. But he had the speed. So they didn't have 40 times back then that were clocked. But on film, he looks like about a 4.45 40 guy. Breakaway speed, but he had the power and the balance that nobody else has as well. So he had the speed, the power, the balance, and he would truck you. Like, he would look for contact. He would truck you. He made guys miss. He broke lots of tackles. He's the most physical running back that I've ever seen, other than Marshawn Lynch, and probably even more powerful than Lynch. and he never missed a single game. And he was invited to the Pro Bowl in every season that he played. He's like Barry Sanders in that he retired early. He's amazing. He ended up with like 126 touchdowns, 12,312 yards. When he finished running, he owned all those records. And he only played 9 years. And it's just kind of crazy. And he's a guy that I've come to appreciate over the last 30 years of just watching films and listening to him. And I appreciate guys from the era before my time that had a profound impact on the game. And that's why he's on my just missed list.
Cool.
And he retired when he was 29. Like, that's just, that would be crazy.
So we'll skip, because I had a couple I've just missed, but let's go ahead and move to.
Okay. Yeah, Randy Moss was my other one, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, Randy Moss was on mine. It was all receivers. It was Randy Moss, Steve Smith, and then I included Tony Gonzalez as a receiver, even though he was a tight end. But
so we're doing. So we're going to skip our top 5 underappreciated Seahawk players of all time. We're just going to go to our top. We're gonna put together a team of all-time Seahawk players that are unappreciated at each position.
You want to start at where do you want to start?
I'll just start at quarterback, whatever.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know if you have them in any particular order. I can't remember if I do either. I think I have offense and then defense.
I drew mine out as a formation, so of where they're playing.
That's fine. Well, I'll start. My most underappreciated and this is my list. I get it. People are going to have different guys. My quarterback is Dave Craig. 6'1", 188 pounds with about 8.5-inch hands. I don't know that to be a fact. I just know it's true.
That was more
because
like 4-inch
he
hands.
holds the NFL record for fumbles by like a very wide margin. But the cool thing about Dave Craig is that he came in from Milton. What was the college? I can't remember. Milton something in Wisconsin. Very small school, and initially, he didn't play his first 2 or 3 years with Seattle. He was riding the bench when Jim Zorn was still the quarterback and transitioning from not being the starter. And when Dave Craig took over in 83, the team just kind of took off to a whole different level. Part of that was Chuck Knox came in, the ground chuck. That was the year also that Kurt Warner was drafted. So we had a good running back. And then things started happening for Seattle at that point. This was the first time Seattle had tasted any sort of success. Dave Craig had a couple of years there in 83 and 84 where we went to the playoffs. I think in 84, we made it to the AFC championship game against the Oakland Raiders and lost that game. But the game before that, we ended up going to Miami and traveling there. And at the end of that game, Dave Craig made this most amazing throw to Steve Largent to kind of put that game away. And so he's just one of my favorite guys. Just complete scrappy dog mentality, for a quarterback. And he's probably, I would think on my list, he could very well be the second best quarterback in franchise history above Hasselbeck, just from the sheer longevity of his career. And the guy could just throw touchdowns. I mean, he could just make stuff happen. He wasn't the most physically gifted guy in the world, but he just had a way of scrappiness of getting stuff done.
So my most underappreciated quarter is Hasselbeck, because I think he gets a really bad rap these days. People talk about, he's just a system guy and wasn't very good. And in the end, he struggled. I mean, after his back injury, he really his in pocket movement was not the same. His ball velocity was down, and probably most importantly, his quick release, getting the ball out of his hand, and how fast it goes from when the ball's not moving to out, his release got way longer and he really struggled to get the ball to people. But before that, there was 3 years in there where he was an elite player. And everyone wants to forget the 3 years where he was an elite player. And I just think that does history a disservice. He was fantastic. And on top of that, a tremendous leader, a guy that everyone on the team knew, respected, liked.
We want the ball. We're going to score. I mean, it takes balls to say that, that's awesome.
Especially when on the first play you throw a pick six.
I know. I never lived that down. That's crazy.
But that's actually part of the reason why I like him, because he was human. He'd make jokes about being bald, and he didn't care about like, I gotta have this image of whatever, and he was just himself, and I really
he had the biggest dad image like in the history of the NFL, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, running backs. I picked 2. I put 2 on my list. Shawn Alexander and Chris Warren are on the list.
I have Chris Warren, because most Seahawk history seems to jump from Kurt Warner to Shawn Alexander.
Mm-hmm.
And they forget that there's a long era in the middle where it was the Chris Warren show. And he was pretty damn good. Yeah. So I had him on there.
Statistically, he's like this, the third best running back, or the second best the team's ever had.
Yeah. So I wanted to go with Alexander, because again, I think he gets a bad rap for how he played the last couple of years. But honestly, Chris Warren needs a lot more love. So he was there. And then I went with a fullback in John L. Williams, which we already talked about.
Yeah. Tight end. I put Atula Mealy.
That's a good pick.
As my tight end.
Not the pick I had. I thought about it though, because he just kept sticking around and kept
making we're talking about unappreciated, not necessarily the best. I just because I think that John, whatchamacallit, was probably the best, but
so I had Zach Miller.
Yeah, Zach Miller's a good choice. John Carlson's the guy I was thinking about.
Yep, John Carlson's a good one too. Zach Miller was never a receiving threat, but he was
with Oakland.
He was with Oakland because teams didn't expect him, and so he'd like leak out, and they were able to get him the ball occasionally. But he pass blocked like a right tackle. You could line him up and give him the responsibility of the best pass rusher on the outside of any team, and he would shut him down. And he's a tight end. He's not a right tackle. And there's a couple different guys that played beside him at right tackle, and they owe their reputation of being decent players entirely to Zach Miller, who played right next to them and did their job for them. Nice. So, Zach Miller, my most underrated.
What do you have for wide receiver?
I have 2, one on each side. Actually, I've got a slot guy too. Brian Blades.
Nice.
The guy who took over for Largent as the lead receiver. And it is tough. And he played through a year or a stretch of just terrible Seahawk teams with terrible quarterback play, right? That gap between, at the end of Dave Craig until the second year of Hasselbeck, it was just disgusting.
The John Kitna years.
Yeah, I mean, he was even like Blades was
Jeff Freeze and
a couple and so I was thinking more of like the Stan Gilbaugh and
right. That's sort of right mediocre. Yeah,
beyond mediocre. That's just awful. But yet he's still one of the top. I think he's number 2 receiver in team history, despite playing with some of the worst teams and the worst quarterbacks in franchise history. So he's on one side, and the other side is Bobby Ingram, nice. Guy that never. I mean, one year he had over 100 receptions and had all those yards.
Really?
Or it wasn't 100 receptions. It was 1,000 yards.
Okay.
And so until recently, he was the most recent 1,000-yard receiver. But other than that, it was, good stats, but nothing great.
Right.
But how many of those catches were on third down?
Mm-hmm.
It felt like every one of them. And I know statistically that's not possible, but it felt like every catch was a third down reception to extended drive.
For me with Doug Baldwin. It just kind of felt that way. Yeah, my two. Well, you had a slot guy. Who's your slot?
A guy that probably most of you have never heard of, Paul Scanzi.
Wow, that goes clear back to the University of Washington. That goes way back.
Little guy, kind of a short career.
When did he play again? Was that in the 80s?
It was.
Yeah.
Little guy, kind of a short career, but was the relief valve for Dave Craig in those early.
For some reason, I thought
early to mid 80 teams.
You were going to say Joe Gervais or something like that.
No.
So my two guys were Darryl Jackson,
which is a good one.
2005 Super Bowl team. Darryl Jackson. The only hang about him was some of the drops that he had on a couple of years, which turned out to be really why he ended up leaving, and then he was injured and so forth. But when he was here, he was very effective as being the number one wide receiver. But he was a small guy. He was only 6 foot, maybe 205 type of thing. And then I put Doug Baldwin as underappreciated because it's difficult. Doug Baldwin's not going to go to a ton of Pro Bowls and all that kind of stuff, but what he did for the team and the attitude that he brought just kind of solidified the wide receiver room for Seattle for a number of years. And being the undrafted guy coming in the same year as Richard Sherman and just having that chip and that whole thing, I think that over time, I believe that a guy like Doug Baldwin will be viewed more as being totally instrumental in some of those offensive wins and so forth.
There was a couple years where he was, a top 15 receiver in the league. And I know that people are like, oh, really? But you go look at the stats, you go look at the film and the acrobatic catches. Mm-hmm. There were a couple of years where he was a legit player on, not just for Seattle, but as looking at the league as a whole. It was very much underappreciated just how good he was.
All right. Who do you got on the offensive line?
Okay. So I went with Russell Okung at left tackle.
I got that.
Edwin Bailey at left guard.
I got that.
Robbie Tobick at center.
I have that.
Chris Gray at right guard.
Nice.
And I
have Brian Millard in there.
And I never came up with a right tackle because right tackle is
tackles because I didn't put a right tackle. I just put Dwayne Brown. And the reason that I put Dwayne Brown is I just believe that after Walter Jones, we always want to compare everyone to that. And and even to this day, even 10 years after Walter Jones, but Dwayne Brown is to me underappreciated because he does solidify that line. He is a great leader. He brings a lot more to the game than just his play. And
right tackle is just a
void of talent.
A void of talent. It's just a desert of I was
waiting for you to say Jermaine Rafetti. Because literally that's all there is, right?
No.
Or Giacomici.
Oh God, they were terrible.
Right? What else is there? You have to go clear back to like Steve August or something.
That's who it was going to be. Steve August from 77 to 84.
Exactly.
And even he was steady at best and not great.
Exactly.
But that's probably the best player.
Yes. And he was drafted, I think, in the second round. So he had some good pedigree to him. All right. In your center, Robbie Tobick, there's no question. This is a guy that's underappreciated. He came in, he has a ton of I think I don't know that he played for Atlanta for a while, and then I think Seattle, primarily with Seattle. But he was a guy that was rock steady, not a Pro Bowl level guy, but he was just below that, and he just gave you everything he had. He was one of those undersized guys at under 300 pounds, and just did his job. you know,
Did his job.
and
Did his
and
job really well,
Super
and
Bowl quarterback.
he solidified a line that needed it because we had the left side of the line was awesome, the right side of the line was terrible, and really
So
what
are
they
we
need.
talking when he played? It was what, Steve Hutchinson,
Yep, and Walter Jones
Walter
on the left
Jones,
side.
and the right side I couldn't even tell you.
It was Chris Gray and a parade of different guys at right tackle. And Chris Gray was a guy the team was constantly trying to replace. They kept drafting players, they kept signing players, they were trying to get rid of him. And yet he has the team record for Ironman, like the most consecutive games played. Despite the fact that they kept trying to get rid of him. And ultimately, when you go back and actually start looking at it, I'm like, he was good on the right side at guard. He was steady. He wasn't dominant, like what we're kind of used to at especially when you look at Hutch on the other side. But he was just, you say it a lot. The best ability is availability, and he was always available. He always played, and they could move him to center. They could move him to right guard or left guard. He could play anywhere. And he played in every game.
Yeah, that's nuts, isn't it? There is a trend, like in these lists that we're building, that's quite a substantial portion of a career spent with Seattle, if not the entire career, and just the Ironman mentality of the players that we're talking about. Like, and that's where I go back to that availability thing. It's like, if you're not available, you're not going to be on this list. And so this list is for guys that are really difference makers and available and have been available. So defensive end, I'll start. Two guys, and they played together in the same era. Jeff Bryant and Jacob Green. Both of them, like especially Jeff Bryant, I think is underappreciated because Jacob Green was on the other side. But Jeff Bryant played his entire career with Seattle, like 11 seasons, started damn near every game. So this is the consistent message. Damn near every game. This is before tackles were recorded and so forth, but he was the bigger of the two defensive ends, and he still ended up with 63 sacks over that period. And just a steady presence. When you're playing all the time and you're not injured, you're really steady. That's what you had opposite of Jacob Green. And then Jacob Green, he was the first premier kind of edge rusher defensive end that Seattle had, and he was very good at it. Ended up with 97 sacks, played his entire career except for one couple games he suited up for San Francisco before he retired and didn't end up playing. But so all those sacks came with Seattle, and just solid guy.
Yeah. I put, Jacob Green as one of mine because I think that, the guy has 25 more sacks than anyone else in Seahawk history. Yeah. And we don't talk about him as being the dominant defensive end that he was. And the other one I picked actually has the number 2 guy in terms of sacks in Seahawk history, and that would be Michael Sinclair.
Wow.
Here's an undrafted guy that, thought was undersized and had to fight for his playing time, and then exploded.
He was on my top 5 underappreciated players of all time, but didn't make my defensive list.
Yep. 16 and a half sacks in 1998 led the NFL. The year before that was 12. The year before that was 13. That's a 3-year stretch of being an absolutely dominant player. And then after that, that's when he was diagnosed with diabetes, and his energy level and his ability to play the number of snaps drastically decreased. And, his career kind of, puttered out there at the end. But like I said, there's some great sack years in there. And I just think that, again, he's a guy that we just don't talk about enough, and should.
Well, and again, he played in the doldrums of the 90s, which is, you're going to get lost in there. Yeah. No, I had him, in my other list. Yeah. All right. So where are we at?
Defensive tackle.
Defensive tackle. Yeah, I had a couple.
I ended up with two guys that both kind of played primarily nose tackle.
Yeah, me too.
With Joe Nash.
Yeah, Joe
and
Nash.
then Sam Adams.
Yeah, and I had Brandon Mebane.
And Brandon Mebane was I had him and then I crossed
totally
him out.
Sam Adams though,
and
too.
Put Sam Adams on there.
Yeah, he was on my short list.
Yep.
Yeah, crazy, interesting. Yeah, Joe Nash, dude, talk about a lunch pail player. Like this is the definition of kind of a workman's lunch pail beer drinking kind of guy that you would want to meet in a bar and have a Seahawks conversation with. And at the end, you know that when you walk out of the bar with Joe Nash, he's going to protect you at all costs. Like that's the kind of guy Joe Nash was. Undersized guy. I think he may have ended up being undrafted. I can't remember for sure.
I think he was. He's a little undersized for a nose tackle, but yet was great at being a nose tackle.
Yes, totally. Totally. And Brandon Mebane, played 7 or 10 years for the Seahawks. And
I was so sad to see him go.
Nice draft pick too. At the time, I think we ended up picking him from California, Cal. And it seems like like a second or third round guy.
He was a third round selection.
Okay. Yeah.
And I was so sad to see him go. I
Me
mean,
too.
I understood it because the team was running into some salary cap problems and needed to pay their stars. But God, I was sad to see him go.
It's linebacker. I've got 3. I've got KJ Wright because he's going to make everyone's underappreciated list.
He should.
And then Keith Butler, who's a guy that's probably nobody's ever heard of that's listening to the show. And then Chad Brown. Keith Butler's a guy that, before stats were kept on tackles is the problem that we're running into here. But Keith Butler was a machine. He was one of the first Seahawks to play linebacker, so he goes way back. And I personally, watched tons of games. We had season tickets to the Seahawks until 89. And so I was able to watch, all these older guys. And then Chad Brown came over from, I think it was Pittsburgh, Keith.
Pittsburgh.
He played like 4 years or 5 years at Pittsburgh, but he gave the vast majority of his prime to the Seattle Seahawks. And he is underappreciated, just like a guy like Lofa Tatupu or whatever, where it's just one of those things where I think people realize, the quality and the level of play and performance that these guys are bringing in until they're gone, and you have a chance to kind of go back and I think Chad Brown's an amazing player.
Yeah. Absolute leader.
Wright, obviously.
Yeah. I mean, those are awesome. You mentioned Lofa Tatupu. He's my middle linebacker.
Wow.
And the one guy I think you forgot, but I didn't include KJ, even though I have been saying
Julian Peterson.
No, I've been saying pretty much consistently since, I don't know, about 2013 that KJ Wright's one of the most underappreciated players in the entire NFL. Somehow he didn't make this team. And I because I wanted to put Anthony Simmons in there.
Oh yeah. Yeah. No, he was on my short list.
And I had to find room for him.
Keith, that is true, because when he played, he had a 3 or 4 year run there with the Seahawks where he was like the prototype linebacker at that position. Yeah. And
he was then what Bobby Wagner is now. Super fast, tackling machine, just everywhere on the field. Just he's the guy. But it wasn't long. Bobby's been doing that, since he was drafted. For Simmons, it was like 3 or 4 years, but he was really good. Only played 6 years though. Bad knee. Mm-hmm. Ended his career early.
Yeah, no, he was amazing. In fact, when he left, it was like, how do we replace that guy?
Yeah.
And time goes on. It's just crazy how we forget.
Yep.
Safety. I kind of combine my safeties and my defensive backs a little bit. Just from an era standpoint, it's hard to kind of define some of the older guys. But my 4 are Cam Chancellor, Eugene Robinson, John Harris, and Terry Taylor. First round selection in 1984, Terry Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
So he ended up only playing 5 seasons for for the Seahawks, and then went on to play for Detroit and Cleveland and so forth. Came back actually for a season, but didn't really play too much for Seattle. But during the time that he was here, I thought he was very good and under appreciated, I think, for the time that he was here.
No, I like it. Yeah, I think
John
that
Harris, by the way, was off the chart. Now he ended up primarily playing more free safety, and I kind of had him listed as a cornerback. But if you go take a look at John Harris's stats, and he played at the same era as Dave Brown, and a lot of people don't know of either player, and it's a shame because John Harris, Dave Brown, and Kenny Easley were all together and played, and that backfield, especially in 1984, was one of the best defensive backfields in the history of NFL football. And it would compare to like the Oakland Raiders defensive backfield during that same era. Like they were talked about on the same level, and with Lester Hayes and those sorts of guys.
just you look at the interception stats that one year.
Crazy.
Where I think you had 4 players that had at least 12 interceptions.
And the returns for touchdowns.
Yeah, it was just crazy.
On that list. Yeah. Yeah, fun season to watch.
So you mentioned Dave Brown. He was the first person that got written down on paper when I was putting this list together.
Yeah, you don't want to forget Dave Brown.
Yeah,
he deserves to be mentioned.
He deserves to be mentioned a lot. Just an absolutely great cornerback that people just don't remember.
And he played such a long time. You know? It's just, it's amazing. It really is amazing.
Yep. And Eugene Robinson at there. I was tempted to put Kenny Easley, but I'd already mentioned him. And there was another guy I wanted to mention, and it's Robert Blackman.
Interesting.
And
yeah, I can see that.
And so, but that's more of just a guy that I just really felt we needed to get in this conversation.
Yeah, no, I think Blackman's a good choice there. The reason that I wanted to put Cam Chancellor is for a similar reason, in that we always talk about Kenny Easley. And I think Cam Chancellor over time may end up getting pushed aside because Richard Sherman was here and Earl Thomas and so forth. And then there's Cam Chancellor, right? So I think Cam Chancellor needs to be on this list.
Cam was a bigger part of the success of the Legion of Boom era than I think people realize. Like there was because Earl Thomas is a multi-year All-Pro, and and Richard Sherman was a multi-year All-Pro. But Cam Chancellor,
he's the KJ Wright of safety.
Yeah, he really is. So that's a great one. My other cornerback, I went with Marcus Trufant.
Yeah.
Which I knew.
This is probably one of the few that I will disagree with you. Just a little bit, but this is an underappreciated, your list. I get it. But
it's people who are underappreciated because, Trufant played.
He was a frustrating player to watch.
A lot of people are like, oh, well, he didn't have a lot of, he didn't have the ball skills, right? He didn't have the number of interceptions.
Did I ever tell you the Jimmy Kennedy, Marcus Trufant story in the draft with my dad? I got to tell you that story here.
Okay. But why I included him. He is 7th in team history in interceptions. So this guy that supposedly that struggled with ball skills, and I get the last couple of years in Seattle after he had a back injury, and then he kind of sucked, and they really needed to move him to free safety because he would have done better there. But before that, he was a solid player, and he had more interceptions than Paul Moyer, than Robert Blackman, than Darryl Williams, Sean Springs, right? I mean, these are players that we think of as being great players for Seattle. And this guy that his reputation of being that he didn't have great ball skills had more interceptions than them.
Well, he didn't have great ball skills, but he had the interceptions. I will give you that. But he did struggle with, getting his head around and all that kind of stuff. I will, but great Seahawk. I mean, he played for a long time here before he moved on, and I get that. So let me tell you this little story. So I'm over at my dad's house for the NFL draft. I can't remember the year Trufant was drafted, and we had a pretty decent pick. I think we were at pick 11 or 12 or something like that overall.
2003.
In 2003. And there was a player out there, a defensive tackle from Penn, Jimmy Kennedy. And all around the Seattle draft hub, if you will, all the kind of draftniks were pining for Jimmy Kennedy to come in, because that was one of our largest needs, was to have a defensive tackle at the time. And Jimmy Kennedy was like all world, and he was going to be sitting there for us. And so was Marcus Trufant and a few other players. But my dad and I had convinced ourselves that Jimmy Kennedy was going to be the pick, because we'd done all the research. We'd done all the, listened to all the pundits, all that kind of stuff. And so the draft comes along, we get to our pick, and we're absolutely positive it's Jimmy Kennedy. My dad's sitting, in the back of the room in his easy chair, and the pick's announced, the Seahawks select Marcus Trufant, cornerback, and my dad was so pissed off. Hi, Dad. That he flicked his shoe off his foot, and the shoe tumbled through the air across the living room towards the TV, right? And I'm thinking, it's all in slow motion, and I'm thinking, oh my God, that shoe is going to hit the TV, and it's going to break the TV, and we're not going to be able to watch the rest of the draft. And my dad's, seething, right? But I think he's realized what he did with his shoe. Luckily, it came up just short of the TV, but that moment will always be between myself and my dad, because it just encapsulated the frustration at that pick, and that's probably why I have that bias where I'm kind of like, Marcus Trufant. So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, I just think that he's underappreciated, because he was a good cover guy. There were a few times where he didn't get his head around, but I think that there was a group of guys with Josh Wilson and Kelly Jennings and that group that were playing at the same time as him, and they were far worse.
Yes,
and he just gets lumped into them, I think, unfairly.
That Josh Wilson thing, that pick was just weird, and B, that Kelly Jennings thing, they hung with him for so long. I just don't even understand. And we can have that conversation at another time. But that was frustrating. Did you do a kicker and a punter?
I didn't.
Okay, I did. So let's go through mine really quick, because it's fun. So my special teams kicker is Norm Johnson. He's just one of those guys that ended up having just an amazing career.
A long career.
Lots of kicks.
Played
forever. So good for Norm. And then Rick Tootin.
Yep.
Everyone's going to remember the Canadian dude. Everyone is going to remember the Australian
Everyone's going to remember the Canadian dude whose name I can't remember right now.
But Putin, you gotta have the Putin Tootin, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just one of those things where he just was an average punter,
he wasn't great, but he played
10 years or whatever for Seattle and just did the job. It's one of those guys that you never really had to talk about, kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. So I would say underappreciated.
Yeah. And he you got to do kicker and punter. I know. And in my head, I go, well, it's going to be Rick Tootin and I don't know, probably Norm Johnson.
Right. Or Brown. Josh Brown was another one.
Yeah, but he's not underappreciated. He's hated.
Yeah. That's true. But he went on to have a tremendous career too.
He was good here. He went on to had a good career elsewhere. He was just, this was the, slave to the businessman and blah, blah, blah when he left Seattle. And it was just like, dude, you're a kicker. Can you just kind of get over yourself?
Well, and the other one was Hauschka. You could put Hauschka on here too. But
yeah. So
I
don't know if I didn't know if he's underappreciated, because everyone is like, we miss Stephen Hauschka.
Yeah, isn't that the truth? I'm just going to go back here and see, if I missed anybody on my list. I did have Richard Sherman in my personal Seahawk top defensive players of all time. He was in my list. And Earl Thomas, just so it's out there, I don't want to think we're forgetting Earl Thomas.
No,
it just didn't make the underappreciated stuff and all that kind of stuff. But
Earl Thomas is a first ballot Hall of Fame safety who's arguably, you're going to hear his name with guys like Ed Reed and Ronnie Lott as the best safety of all time.
So my top 5 defensive players all time, and Keith, you just didn't make this list, but I did, so I'll just share it really quick. Cortez Kennedy, list. Bobby Wagner, Kenny Easley, Eugene Robinson, Richard Sherman, just missed Dave Brown, Earl Thomas, Chad Brown. And then on offense, it was Russell Wilson, Walter Jones, Steve Largent, DK Metcalf, Marshawn Lynch. I put DK Metcalf at number 4 as top offensive players of all time, and he's had 2 seasons. And that's kind of crazy, but I'm thinking
he can get there.
Well, it's not even almost that he can get there. It's like he's already there. He just statistically has not put the numbers up to prove it yet. And I think that is going to happen.
So he is already, after 2 seasons, number 14 on the team list of receiving yards.
Yeah, I had no idea. That's crazy.
2 seasons, ahead of Golden Tate, Jermaine Kearse, Jimmy Graham, Paul Scanzi, who I mentioned earlier, Sean Dawkins, Daryl Turner, Christian Fourier.
Deep Heat Turner.
Right? Sidney Rice, which I guess he only played for a couple of years.
Yeah, but DK Metcalf destined to break every receiving record in the history of the Seahawks if he can play, if they keep him and so forth. In this era, I noticed doing these things that a lot of the folks that we were talking about prior to like 2005 played their entire career with Seattle.
Yep.
And since then, it's just harder and harder to keep players for a long period of time. So these lists will be interesting to like 25 years from now. It's like the guy's only played 4 years in his first 4-year contract, and that was it.
Yeah. But looking at Metcalf, he's already 14th. He's only had 2 years. By the end of if he produces at the same level he did his first 2 years, and there's no reason to think that he won't exceed that greatly. But if he plays at the same level for the next 2 years, he will already be 7th ahead of Joey Galloway.
Yeah. So if Russell Wilson, using the same sort of logic, if Russell Wilson plays an additional 9 years at a career average level, he will be statistically a top 5 quarterback and could get to number 3 in NFL history in touchdowns and quite a few other different categories. So he'll be in the same conversation as Brett Favre, Dan Marino,
Elway, Marino,
Drew Brees, and
Peyton Manning.
That's a pretty nice list.
Mm-hmm.
Those are all Hall of Fame guys.
Yep. So
I think that's interesting. Yeah. So fun. God, this was a fun show. It's interesting going and digging back.
So we were just talking about receiving yards, and I just want to go down the list in Seattle. Steve Largent, of course, number 1. Brian Blades, we talked about him earlier too. Number 3 on the list, all time in Seattle history, Doug Baldwin.
Wow, I didn't know that.
And then Darryl Jackson, you mentioned earlier, is 4th. Tyler Lockett is 5th.
Wow. Yeah, DK is going to be up there quickly, isn't he?
Very quickly. Like I said, all he plays is his rookie contract and then leaves. So 4 years. He'll already be 7th, above Joey Galloway, Corin Robinson, Deion Branch.
Corin Robinson
Sherman.
was the most frustrating player to ever play in a Seahawks uniform, other than the tight end guy from Washington.
Yep.
University of Washington.
Jeremy Stevens.
They both had similar issues.
Yep. Corin Robinson had so much talent. He could have been.
Yeah. We drafted him like number 9 overall, I believe.
He could have been Randy Moss.
he was similar to a player that the Portland Trailblazers drafted that had similar issues, drugs, alcohol, behavior type stuff. I can't remember his name, but his upside was so high and just fell short, and it's a tough deal to watch that happen in real time. But
Yep.
So what did you think about our list? Think it
I
was a
liked
good
them.
show?
It was fun. We should do this more often with come up with different criteria, because
I agree.
We came up with that we were going to do this show this week, and literally I sat down that day. I couldn't, because normally I let these things kind of, fester into my mind a little bit before I sit down and write stuff out. That day I was so excited about doing this that I was like writing down players, just give me some names that are out there. And
yeah, fun. I had to wait a little bit. I had some stuff that I was working on, but the last 2 days I've spent with a lot of time kind of thinking about this, and so it's a fun show. It's a lot of names that folks haven't had a chance to look at or watch. I would suggest, especially like the big time pass catchers and running backs that are on our list, go out and watch some highlights of those guys, because they're super fun. Walter Payton, Jim Brown, Barry Sanders. Like
we didn't mention him, but add Gale Sayers to the list.
Wow. Yeah.
So if you're looking at the all-time greats, was there any name that you came across that didn't get mentioned in the show that was just like the most random, like, hey, I remember that, but I wouldn't have if I hadn't done the research?
Oh my goodness.
Also, we did an underrated show without mentioning Max Strong.
That's fine. I did mention Max Strong before we recorded.
Yeah, that was a serious mistake by us.
But when we were going to press record, you said, but what can we show that Max Strong actually did? And I was like, well, he was the Iron Man guy. Mm-hmm. He was the guy that pretty much played every game, and he could block anybody. And
so
I don't have a name in particular. I mean, we mentioned Steve August. I mean, that goes kind of in the Wayback Machine. John Yarno was a great was a great center from yesterday, that played for Chuck Knox. So he was a perfect Chuck Knox guy. In fact, and Reggie McKenzie, those guys.
That's a good one.
That come in for like 2 or 3 years. John Randall was a guy that we got at the tail end of his career, but he was such an animal, like literally an animal. So when they interviewed him, and this is back in the day when there's no internet or anything like that. So you watch these things on the 6 o'clock news and the sports section, and they're like 35 seconds or whatever. And you could just see that John Randall's like a spitting, animalistic kind of Tasmanian devil type character, right? And it plays out that way on the field. So characters like that are always kind of interesting and fun to try to figure out,
Random name that I came across that I was like, oh yeah, like it never would have occurred to me that like I could not have remembered that this player existed until I came across it. Ben Obumano.
Oh wow, yeah. 5
years in there, right up until he was still on the team in 2012.
Mm-hmm.
Right, he was there. He left right before the Super Bowl run, but there from the end of the last few years of Mike Holmgren.
Did he have any catches? He was a wide receiver, right?
Yeah. But he was a special teams guy. Yeah. He had 153 receptions for 1,209 yards in 5 years.
So we'll have to do a show sometime where we do the top 5 list of really, really good famous players that ended up on the Seahawks at one time or another.
like Jerry Rice,
Carl Eller, or Franco Harris.
What about Benny Blades?
Benny Blades, corner.
Never. He was a safety.
Safety, yeah.
But he Brian Blades' brother, signed with Seattle, and was like top level at the time, and then came to Seattle, never played it down.
Yeah. Wow. Dwight Feeney.
Yeah. For like 3 weeks.
Yeah. Edgerrin James.
Yeah, he had nothing left.
Isn't that crazy? I mean, just names, just like, that guy. Yeah, well, he really didn't do anything. We just got him too late. He was just camp fodder by that point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, interesting.
Antoine Winfield.
Yeah.
Cornerback.
His son I wanted to draft his son. I talked about him a lot pre-draft, and he ended up being a player for Tampa. So I want that pick. I really do, because I knew I just watched that guy and watched him interview, and it's just one of those things where you just realize that he's going to be a player, and he got passed over in the draft pretty good. Ended up being a player. Yeah, fun. All right. Next week. Oh, I forgot to tell you. Next week, we've got our Jajor brothers back on to. I believe we're doing an NFC Roundup show. To talk about the offseason from our NFC West rivals and find out what they've done, how we're going to compare to those guys, and then talk about the Sports on Tap websites and all their affiliates and how they blend culture and sports into their websites. And they're pretty interesting. So we'll have a good conversation there, and they are on next week. So anything else, Keith? We'll get out of here.
No, let's get out of here.
All right.
Good show.
Find Keith on Twitter at Myers NFL and at NW Seahawk. The show is at Hawks Playbook, SeahawksPlaybook.com, which has been completely revamped. Go check it out. Has all the podcasts and a whole bunch of other stuff. And find us on your favorite podcast app and YouTube. So until next time, go Hawks.
Go Hawks.
Seahawks Playbook Podcast listeners, thanks for joining us for another edition of the show. You can find us on Twitter. Bill is at NW Seahawk, Keith is at Myers NFL, and the show is at Hawks Playbook. You can listen and subscribe to the show at SeahawksPlaybook.com.